But you make an interesting link where you talk about the decline of the whaling industry and the subsequent rise of this thing called blackbirding.
Even though the US left can tell you about real and imagined misdeeds of Moscow and Eastern Europe, many of them have no clue about the fact that the 50th and presumed final state of the United States of America is an occupied nation, that there'll probably be Hawaii sovereignty again before the end of this century. Hollywood seems to be against the rise of capitalism in Japan. Such an approach is used by another African-American historian, Gerald Horne, who more recently framed 19th century Hawaiian diplomacy in the context of the global resistance to white supremacy.
Hello and welcome everyone. This is episode 13 of De Facto. I'm Anthony Ballas, and I'm once again joined by Dr. Gerald Horne, Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, author of 47 books or so. That's at least according to Ryan Napoli's latest count. Ryan from Activist News Network, shout out to Ryan. Your latest two books, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader, edited by Tion Paris. Shout out to Tion as well. And Acknowledging Radical Histories, conversations with Gerald Horne, which you did with Chris Time-Steele, who's a very good friend of mine, in fact. And so I just wanted to give a special shout out to Chris, because Chris is who introduced me to your work. He's who encouraged me to, in fact, get in touch with you several years ago. And so I guess in some sense we have to thank Chris for these interviews and these collaborations in some sense. So just want to give a special shout out to Chris. In any case, Dr. Horne, welcome back. Thank you for joining me once again.
Thank you for inviting me.
So since today we're going to be talking about your book, The White Pacific, I figured I'd begin by asking you a little bit about your recent research excursion to Honolulu. But I also want to know, I'm curious to learn about what inspired you to start researching in the South Seas and in the Pacific more generally. So can you give us a little bit of insight into what sparked your interest in this book? And then what some of your, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about some of your more current research.
Well, what drove me to the South Seas initially was a research project ostensibly dealing with blackbirding, which is a subject of that book, The White Pacific. That is to say, post-1865, post-US Civil War, you have forced labor involving Melanesians and Polynesians being dragged to Fiji and to Queensland, Australia in particular. And I was interested in the role of US nationals because I was also involved in a project on tracking these US nationals and their involvement in enslavement of Africans outside of the borders of the United States, in Brazil, for example, that eventuated in the book, The Deepest South, the United States, Brazil, and the African Slave Trade, and their role in Cuba, that eventuated in the book, Race to Revolution, the United States and Cuba during slavery and Jim Crow. And so this was sort of a follow-on. But I came to realize that in order to tell a full story about blackbirding, I would have to learn more and write more about the Hawaii Kingdom. And there hangs a tale, because as it turns out, the Hawaii Kingdom was an extraordinary political experiment. Even though we know that, as I detail in the book, that it tried to effectuate an alliance in the late 19th century with a rising Japan. And as I have come to find as a result of my recent research, a rising China in the late 19th century as well. And part of its mandate, speaking of the Hawaii Kingdom, was to try to block blackbirding. And that was a factor amongst many that led to its demise. And so my recent foray into Honolulu was to do research that deals with the role of Hawaii in terms of the rise of what is referred to as US imperialism. Now, the rise of US imperialism is oftentimes dated from the 1890s, although to be fair, I think we'd have to acknowledge that before reaching Hawaii and the Philippines and overthrowing the Spanish Empire's role in Cuba and Puerto Rico, the United States had waged war against numerous Native American sovereign nations as well. And we have to include that story as part of the creation and origin story of US imperialism. But having said that, I think it's also fair to say that the Hawaii Kingdom occupies a special role with regard to the rise of US imperialism. And this needs to be underlined and underscored for a number of reasons. One is that there's been considerable research in Hawaii and elsewhere, including the South Pacific, on this topic. And two, even though the US left can tell you in excruciating detail about real and imagined misdeeds of Moscow and Eastern Europe from 1917 forward, many of them have no clue about the fact that the 50th and presumed final state of the United States of America, speaking of to Hawaii, according to many credible international law sources, is an occupied nation, not just an occupied colony, as a way you could describe Puerto Rico. It's an occupied nation because before the so-called bayonet constitution imposed by the settlers mostly Euro-American, on the Hawaii Kingdom in 1887, basically stripping the monarchy of power, and the overthrow by 1893, before those ultimate events, you had Hawaii that had diplomatic legations and consulates in 102 separate nations. And not only that, but the records are all in the Hawaii archives. That's what I was looking at during my recent trip. I mean, they had legations in Pretoria, delegations in Singapore and Europe. The king was the first head of state to take an around the world trip, which he did in 1881, alighting in Asia and Africa and in Europe. So you had this diplomatic powerhouse, and they were trying to organize these small, about to be colonies, including Fiji, Samoa, Tahiti, occupied by France, the so-called Micronesian islands, etc. And that was an objection of the settlers. And what's interesting is that, once again, when folks, including our friends on the left, when they analyze the United States of America, they oftentimes suggest that the overthrow of monarchy and the installation of republicanism, as it's called, or anti-monarchy, is a great leap forward. But you don't have to dig that deeply. You only have to go as far as Hawaii to say that the overthrow of the monarchy in Hawaii and its replacement by republicanism was not a great leap forward, it was a great leap backwards. Not least because one of the first things that the settlers did was to circumscribe voting rights to people like themselves, for example. But as noted, fortunately, there's a tremendous literature on this subject. This is not a secret. And what is rather dispiriting, after writing a book on Texas, the counter-revolution of 1836, and now preparing this next book, the counter-revolution of 1893, what I find striking is that the indigenous polities of Texas and a good deal of North America, the kinds of records you have in Honolulu are not there. The kinds of diplomatic alliances that Hawaii tried to effectuate with Japan in particular, that was generally absent. with regard to Native American policies. But as it turned out, both were overthrown. So I find that rather dispiriting. You have one group of indigenous people who pursued a path of modernity, so to speak. In some ways, Hawaii had electricity before many parts of the mainland, had telephones before many parts of the mainland North America, being president of the United States, diplomatic legations in scores of sites all around the world, sending their head of state on round the world tours to effectuate diplomatic alliances. But alas, they still were overthrown. And then, interestingly enough, many of the Native American policies, they were better armed than the Hawaiians, particularly the Comanches, as I talk about in my book on Texas, but they still were defeated. And so there's a lesson somewhere to be gleaned. And hopefully that can be at least an epilogue in this forthcoming book, The Counter-Revolution of 1893, The Hawaiian Coup, and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in Southeast Asia and the Pacific.
Wow, yeah, thank you for that broad overview and for introducing us to your upcoming work. Sounds like it's going to act as kind of a sequel to this text, The White Pacific in many ways, which more or less ends around 1893, although you have an epilogue having to do with Pearl Harbor that I'd like to ask you about in a little while. But backing up just a little bit, so I had never seen this term blackbirding before. And my knowledge of the whaling industry, for instance, in the South Seas is, let's just say I only know about the whaling industry through Herman Melville, who actually makes a couple appearances in your book. But you make an interesting link where you talk about the decline of the whaling industry and the subsequent rise of this thing called blackbirding. Now, you just mentioned blackbirding, but I wonder, can you talk about how the decline of the whaling industry led to the rise of blackbirding?
Well, part of it could be put simplistically in the sense that with the rise of oil, an oil industry, particularly reference the rise of the Rockefeller family, the so-called discovery of this fuel in Pennsylvania, you have the decline of whaling because there was the so-called oil from whales that were used to light lamps in homes to rescue folks from darkness and oblivion. But then, as oftentimes happens, that particular industry was overtaken by events, but then it leads to all of these ships with needing something to do, so to speak. And so many of the ships are then transformed into vessels carrying bonded labor. And this, of course, takes place at the same time that the US Civil War is coming to a close, which basically ends a centuries-long chapter in terms of transporting enslaved Africans to do bonded labor or to work for free, the unpaid sector of the working class, as I call them. And as noted, that leads to the intervention or the attempted intervention of the Hawaii Kingdom. And so what's interesting also about whaling is that, as a number of scholars have pointed out, historically, there had been a critical mass of Black seafarers. In fact, you have an early Black American population in Honolulu who were oftentimes seafarers. This goes back to the early 1800s, in fact. And you can find detail on this in another book, They Came with the Trade Winds, another University of Hawaii Press book. University of Hawaii Press has done an outstanding job in churning out these books. including my own. I've published 2 books on Hawaii thus far. And so what's interesting as well is that the Hawaii Kingdom puts white supremacy in a bind, because other nations that are considered to be part of the family of nations and non-colonies, they are not as obsessed with melanin content as U.S. imperialism has been. In fact, I might have told the story in my White Pacific book. I'll certainly tell it in this upcoming book about an heir to the throne in Honolulu arriving in Washington, D.C. in 1850 and being discriminated against in terms of riding a train. And he refers in his diary to this as being a kind of so-called confounded foolishness. And obviously, this is complicating the ability of U.S. to compete with other nations, Japan not least, but also with Great Britain, which had preceded the United States in terms of outlawing the African slave trade, abolished slavery in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Tobago decades before the United States did, and was seeking an alliance with the Hawaii Kingdom. If you look at the Hawaii flag today, and interestingly enough, when you go to Honolulu, you see the Hawaii flag all over the place. You may even see it more than the U.S. flag. And as a person who lives in Texas, which is the opposite of Hawaii, insofar as it too was once an independent nation, the Republic of Texas that seceded from Mexico in 1836 in order to continue slavery, and the Lone Star flag can be found all over Austin, but I don't think the Lone Star flag is as prominent in Austin as the Hawaiian flag is prominent in Honolulu, for example. And this bespeaks the fact that by some measures, the indigenous Hawaiian population is larger than what's called the Hale population, Haole, Hawaiian word that's used as a synonym for what we would call, quote, white, unquote. And this is due in part to the legacy of the monarchs, because Hawaii was officially annexed by the United States in 1898. And what's interesting is just like Texas, this was supposed to have happened by treaty, but they didn't have the votes. And so they did it by resolution, which means that it's putatively unconstitutional, although with today's Supreme Court, I don't think that you can bring that case credibly. But what happens in the interlude between the coup of 1893, which establishes the Republic of Hawaii, led by the Dole family, yes, that Dole family, which you may associate with pineapples, a primary Hawaiian export. So between the 1893 coup and the 1898 annexation, you had continued conflict between other powers with which Hawaii had brokered relations, Japan not least, because the settlers, they saw Japan as a threat. And so they were trying to prevent Japanese nationals from voting, or excuse me, Japanese folk in Hawaii from voting, which was not pleasing to Tokyo. And so you had Japanese warships sailing into Honolulu in the prelude to annexation. At the same time, the US warships are traversing Honolulu on their way to the Philippines to oust the Spanish, for example, which they successfully do. So it's a very conflicted situation that arises. And I'm not an oracle. My crystal ball is in mothballs. But I don't think you need to be an avid prognosticator to suggest that there'll probably be Hawaii sovereignty again before the end of this century. It's an occupied nation. It's it's obscene that its cause has not been adopted by more of our so-called progressive, radical, and revolutionary forces on the mainland.
Wow, yeah, no, that's wonderful. I wanted to ask you about what you thought the future would hold, and so I'm glad you addressed that. And in the book, you talk about the essentially the movement to change the 50-star U.S. flag into a 49-star U.S. flag, which may be on the horizon in this century. Um, I was also really interested in the book about what you call this Confederate diaspora
Mm-hmm.
after the breakup of the Confederate States, after the U.S. Civil War, and the rise subsequently when this diaspora spreads to the South Pacific and in Hawaii and Australia and Fiji, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in this region, which was very consequential. Can you talk a little bit about the rise of the Klan in the Pacific?
Well, first of all, your audience should realize that even in certain quarters today, excuse me, the Klan understandably has a smelly reputation. But speaking realistically, it's not an exaggeration to suggest that the Ku Klux Klan was a mass organization, not least in Dixie, post 1865, until recently in Memphis, Tennessee. There was a statue honoring a reputed founder of the Ku Klux Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And that statue was taken down. There was outrage in certain circles on the usual spurious grounds that this is doing a disservice to history. Although, of course, we have not heard such claims with regard to post 1776 when statues of King George were taken down on the North American mainland in the so-called 13 colonies. Somehow that claim has not been made. And in any case, you've had other iterations of the Klan, including with the debut of the Klan-loving film, Birth of a Nation, under the leadership of D.W. Griffith, based upon a novel, The Klansman, which was wildly popular. One of the first films shown in the White House, which Virginian, by way of New Jersey, President Woodrow Wilson, described reputedly as history written in lightning. This is his description of cinema. That leads to a second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, which has mass support from the Atlantic to the Pacific and the Atlantic through the Pacific. Because what I found out during my research in Fiji was that their claws and tentacles have reached to that archipelago as well. Mm-hmm. And as I tell the story of Fiji, they have a crushing dilemma insofar as they are being targeted by US imperialism or proto-US imperialism and Klan-like forces. They're being targeted by the British Empire. And that does not leave many choices. Of course, Australia is a member in good standing of the British Empire and is one of Fiji's closest and most powerful neighbors, ditto for New Zealand. And speaking of New Zealand, I should also mention the fact that what was concerning Hawaii was that in its neighborhood, it could see what was going on with the ouster from rule of many of the indigenous of New Zealand, speaking of the Maoris, Maori, by the British as early as the 1840s, involving massive bloodshed. And once again, it did not take a soothsayer to suggest that unless Hawaii acted swiftly and rapidly, the whole neighborhood would be overtaken, including Fiji. Another footnote with regard to Fiji, when I was out there some years ago doing this research, this is sort of unfortunate humor that many of the Fijians have this unique hair that I now carry on my head. And it reminded me of the advertising campaigns that Johnson Hair Care products had administered towards the Black population of the United States, encouraging them to straighten their hair, which of course is still popular in certain quarters, particularly amongst women. As a matter of fact, there have been lawsuits where Black women are suggesting that they feel compelled to straighten their hair in order to keep their jobs. And as a matter of fact, that sort of dilemma has been a staple of the critical race theory scholars, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, for example, looking at the litigation and the case law with regard to that particular kind of litigation. So I was thinking, I wonder why Johnson Hair Care Products hadn't come to Fiji and run an advertising campaign to convince people that they should straighten their hair, which of course would expand their markets. They could have done the same thing in Maui. Perhaps I shouldn't say that because even though I think that particular company is now defunct, it might put an idea in the heads of some other entrepreneur come capitalist. But in any case, what folks need to realize is that propaganda to the contrary, these Euro-American settlers who are alighting in Hawaii, in Honolulu and Maui and Kauai and Lanai and down to Samoa and over to Fiji and the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea. These are not good people. I mean, in the sense that it's not as if they're coming with charity in their minds. And even those who supposedly come with charity in their minds, speaking of the missionaries, who were sort of an advanced wave of colonialism in Hawaii in the 1820s, as the popular saying in Hawaii now goes, when the missionaries arrived, they had the Bible and we had the land, speaking of the indigenous, but it did not take long for them to have the land and for the indigenous to have the Bible. That was the kind of transfer that took place. And in fact, the so-called Bayonet Constitution in Hawaii in 1887 and the coup of 1893 was done under the popularized name of the Missionary Party.
So you mentioned already this kind of fear of Hawaiian supremacy. And I believe in the book, when you talk about Hawaiian supremacy, you have a question mark after it. Because the question is, there's this kingdom that seems to have political diplomacy over the region, but there's also this fear of African-American influence in the region, especially perhaps after the U.S. Civil War. You describe a Negroification of the region, and you describe some of these figures: Joseph, Black Bill, Black Tom Tilden, John Brown, a different John Brown than the John Brown of Harper's Ferry, West India Jack, and so on. And then there's King Kamehameha and King Kalakaua of Hawaii, who are both thought to have African-American lineage. So can you talk a little bit about these twin threats of African-American influence and Hawaiian supremacy, a little more, a threat to the whiteness of the region?
Well, by invoking the Negro question, many of the settlers were playing upon the fears and hysteria of the U.S. itself, where there has been a Black scare historically, going back, as historians are increasingly pointing out, to the founding of the Republic in the 1770s, with a trigger being Lord Dunmore, the last British governor of Virginia, seeking to squash the rebels by offering freedom to the enslaved and organizing an Ethiopian regiment. Even Benjamin Quarles, who was a contemporary of the late John Hope Franklin, a Black historian who taught at Morgan State University in Baltimore for years, wrote an influential article that is, if I'm not mistaken, repeated in his book, The Negro in the American Revolution, published in 1961, that says something like Lord Dunmore is liberator, with Lord Dunmore being seen as a precursor to Abraham Lincoln, who sought to save the bacon of the US itself with the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees the enslaved, where Lincoln has no jurisdiction, and does not free them where he does have jurisdiction. Although that's a bit much, because in 1862, the enslaved were freed in Washington, D.C., which would be the subject of a chapter or a few paragraphs in a book I'm working on now.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of Negroes with guns was something that was a fearful preoccupation of the settlers in North America. And by seeking to associate the monarchy in Honolulu with Negroes, suggesting that they were no more than Negroes. And of course, they were melanin rich. Many of them were rather dark skinned, which is why you had the incident on the train in Washington, D.C. in 1850 that I alluded to a moment ago. That gave resonance and altitude to these fears of that culminates in what I call the Black Scare. And so the Black Scare then is buoyed by the fact that coming into Hawaii, or the aforementioned seafarers on whaling ships, there is quite a bit of writing on this Black American with roots in Schenectady, New York, by the name of Anthony Allen, who by the 1820s was a major force in the economy of Honolulu. And by the way, Anthony Allen also made his way in his voyages to what is now Indonesia. And you can say the same for a number of Black Americans, because look, Black Americans were trying to get as far away from the United States as they possibly could. And that brought some of them, for example, to Australia. That brought some of them to New Zealand. In fact, in another book that I wrote, I talked about the analogy between this movement called the Ratana in New Zealand, Ratana, and what we now know as the Nation of Islam, except that Ratana was Christian, quote unquote, and obviously the Nation of Islam was not, although it relies heavily upon scripture. I think that is told in my book, Race War, which deals in part with African Americans in Japan. And so Hawaii supremacy seemed to be recreating some of the worst and most overheated fears of the settlers, in the sense that here you had these dark-skinned leaders who are seeking to organize in the region. The Pacific is the defining characteristic of this small planet that we reside on, occupying more space than even Russia does on this planet, speaking of this largest country by territory on planet Earth. And the fact that this was happening at a time when the major European powers, and including the United States, are flexing their muscles, seeking to grab colonies and territories, and being joined, if not countered, by a rising Japan, which of course is not greeted with equanimity in the United States and to a certain degree in Europe as well, but was embraced by the Hawaiian monarchy to the point that even today, by some measures, the plurality of the population in the archipelago of the Hawaiian Islands is of Japanese extraction, which reflects this developing alliance between the kingdom and Tokyo, which they tried to cement with a marital alliance. And of course, as I talk about in another book, crafty Tokyo tried to effectuate a marital alliance also with the royal family in Ethiopia. At least that was bruited in the 1930s, which of course, if you had whispered such in North America, you might be subjected to a lynching. That is to say, a marital alliance, say, between the Windsors and London and the Ethiopian royal family in Addis, or between, say, the Roosevelts in Washington. I mean, it's difficult to not chuckle just to think about that kind of suggestion. So this is the contradiction that white supremacy is finding itself in, and still finds itself in to a certain degree, in the sense of trying to pay homage to the old ways that helped to create the republic, white supremacy not least, while at the same time trying to adapt to a rapidly changing international situation where polities and political leaders are not as taken by white supremacy, to put it mildly.
Mm-hmm.
That's the squeeze that Washington faces, which leads to their scorning of what's called Hawaiian supremacy. Now, I should also say, and some of my indigenous Hawaii friends might object, but what I find fascinating about Hawaii is that a number of Hollies were actually a pro-monarchy. Don't ask me why I'm surprised by that. Perhaps, I mean, I have stereotypical opinions. If so, it may be a product of growing up in Jim Crow United States of America. But that needs to be said. And one of the comrades of the monarchy, before the Bayonet Constitution of 1887, he was a minister in that government, Walter Murphy Gibson. He was threatened with lynching, by the settlers. He was seen as a turncoat. The very idea of Hawaiian supremacy and this idea of coming together of these microstates and territories and islands coming together comes out of what the Hawaiians would call a Holly from Australia, for example, who wound up doing diplomatic labor in Melbourne, if I'm not mistaken, for the Hawaii Kingdom. So, in thinking about this, then this made me think about, well, maybe as a Black American, as one scholar said about my book, The White Pacific, I'd let the African American studies lens invade that book unduly, was the charge. And perhaps I should plead guilty to that charge and contemplate it. And I have been contemplating it. And I think that there is a difference in the sense that the Black American community comes out of the unpaid sector of the working class. And that throws off quite a bit of friction and tension, being unpaid labor. And that was a question, as I say in my Texas book, that's enforced against the Euro-American settler population who might want to dissent. They could be lynched. On the cover of my Texas book, these are Euro-Americans who are being lynched, who are perceived as being pro-Negro, for example. And of course, the South Seas question, it's in part a question of bonded labor, but it's largely a question of land. It's a question of sovereignty. It's a question of political power. I mean, in retrospect, you could see perhaps where certain Hollies might feel that the Hawaiian Kingdom had a winning ticket. They were in power. They were effectuating diplomatic relations with Tokyo, with other powerful nations. And pragmatically, it seemed as if they had a winning ticket. Whereas with the U.S. Negroes, I mean, they were slaves. I mean, they were unpaid labor. They didn't have any power. And that's not the kind of equation that oftentimes attracts external supporters.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, that's very interesting rumination on your book. What, 20, almost 20 years since, right? It's been. You've returned to this question of diplomatic relations with Japan, which is a really interesting feature of this argument, that this fear of King Kalakawa's diplomatic relations, which apparently were global. I didn't know that. I thought they were, he was traveling around the Pacific, certainly, as you describe in this book, but there was a threat of the Asiatic Pacific, so-called. The threat that the Pacific, leading all the way up to California, was going to become overrun by Imperial Japan if the United States didn't step in. But so you've covered that. It's very interesting. We could also talk about the preponderance of Japanese labor strikes in Hawaii that you mentioned in the book. You already mentioned the voter suppression of Hawaiian nationals who were living in, of Japanese nationals living in Hawaii. So that's leading up to the coup of 1893. But another conclusion you have in this book, which is very interesting, is that these sort of diplomatic global relations were extremely consequential in the 20th century with the events of December 1941 in Pearl Harbor. Can you talk a little bit about how this political situation in the Pacific leads to Pearl Harbor?
Well, first of all, I mean, let's set the stage by beginning with what China still calls the century of humiliation, the seizure of Hong Kong by Britain in the early 1840s, which also is perceived as a threat region-wide. This is followed about a decade later by the so-called U.S. black ships sailing into Japan, and a fear on the part of Japan that if they're not careful, they'd become the next Hong Kong. This leads to an amazing turnaround, culminating in what's called the Meiji Restoration and the decline of feudal forces in Japan, the rise of capitalist forces in Japan, which, by the way, as a scholar of cinema and literature, it brings to mind the film The Last Samurai of Tom Cruise, which is interesting because, just to digress for a moment, here's a film that has those tumultuous events of the 1860s in Japan as a backdrop, with, of course, Tom Cruise with this Japanese lady. But what's interesting is that Hollywood seems to be against the rise of capitalism in Japan, that they're turning the feudal forces into heroes, so to speak. And I guess because they see the capitalist forces as much more of a threat, which, of course, in a sense, they were and are. A footnote here, I've been making reference in various interviews lately to the continuing conflict between the United States and Japan, despite the fact that both are concerned, put it euphemistically, about the rise of China, with regard to both Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump being against Nippon Steel of Japan, taking over a flailing and failing steel enterprise in the United States of America, which is very curious because I'm not sure how the United States can keep Japan on side while engaging in such maneuvers. And of course, that's of a piece with the apparent impending banning of TikTok,
Right.
the app of ByteDance, for example. So the United States is going to be fighting the Asians on two fronts, for example. But in any case, the Meiji Restoration and the rise of Japan has a confluence with the monarchy being concerned about annexation. And annexation was nothing new. It had been bruited early on, even before, in fact, Britain's seizure of Hong Kong in the early 1840s, because US strategists, when they looked at their map, they saw Hawaii as the landmass, the territory between a rising Asia and the US West Coast. By some measures, Hawaii is the most isolated place on planet Earth, and already, as noted, had been a fueling stop for whalers who were seeking these huge mammals. And so when the monarch travels to Japan and effectuates these sorts of acts, it leads certain scholars to suggest that Hawaii was not only embarked on sort of a pan South Seas or pan Oceania coalition, they were involved in pan Asian diplomacy. In fact, some scholars are suggesting that rather than Hawaii learning from Japan, it was Japan that was learning from Hawaii. Because, in a sense, in terms of so-called modernity, Hawaii had embarked on that path well before Japan did. And so, as noted, that leads to the transporting across the Pacific many Japanese laborers, and the effort by the Hollies to prevent them from not only voting, but engaging in labor struggles. You know, I did a second book,
Right.
Fighting in Paradise, which deals with 20th century Hawaii and the run-up to statehood in 1959, and the role of communists and the West Coast Longshore under the leadership of Australian-American Harry Bridges in organizing the islands. And to this very day, Hawaii probably has the most significant labor density, a union density, I should say, of any state under the US flag. It is the bluest of the blue states, to put it in traditional US jargon. That is to say, in terms of being pro-choice, in terms of pro-DEI agenda, which of course is understandable, since the Holly population, with all due respect, is only about 13% of the population, which is about the size of the indigenous population, with, of course, a sizable Korean, Filipino, Japanese, Chinese, et cetera, populations, and of course a US Negro or US Black population of about 3%. And of course, I've just written an article where I point out the irony of so many seeing the election of Obama as some sort of breakthrough for the United States, without seeing that here is a president who was born in an occupied nation that was forcibly incorporated into the United States of America. And somehow that got lost sight of, which, given the fact that we're talking about the United States, should not be seen as a surprise.
Wow, that's very good. Very elucidating on this excellent text of yours, The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas After the Civil War. Get yourself a copy. I really enjoyed reading this book. It made me really excited to read your Fighting in Paradise book, which is kind of a follow-up in the 20th century, as you mentioned. And I'm very excited to see when the counter-revolution of 1893 comes out, so we can round out a sort of trilogy, perhaps. Is it a culmination of kind of two trilogies, actually? Because you've got the Pacific trilogy, in a sense, but you've also got this counter-revolution trilogy.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And before we conclude, let me bring out some other books.
Please, please.
So let me start with this one. This is a good book, A Power in the World, the Hawaiian Kingdom and Oceania. That's where I got some of my concepts about Pan-Asianism, etc. This is a German scholar who's at the University of French Polynesia.
Can you hold it up for us?
In Tahiti.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very good. I mean, I respect this book quite a bit, even though he's the one who said, I'll read it to you on page 12. He says, let's see. Such an approach is used by another African-American historian, Gerald Horne, who more recently framed 19th century Hawaiian diplomacy in the context of a global resistance to white supremacy, arguing that a Hawaiian-led League of Afro-Asian and Pacific nations would have offered, quote, alternatives to colonialism, unquote, by establishing, quote, Hawaiian supremacy that it would lead to a, quote, Black Pacific, unquote, instead of a, quote, white one. Overall, Horne provides a good characterization of Hawaiian foreign policy. Nonetheless, his focus is somewhat limited because he attempts to transplant an African-American studies perspective into the Pacific, an approach that only partially works. Whatever.
Well, of course, we should point out that, of course, and this is, I think, important. It's small, but you have a question mark after Hawaiian supremacy. So it is really, you're actually asking it as a question.
Right.
And just
that phrase is from this aforementioned Australian. He's the one who came up with this idea.
Okay.
And was pushing the monarchy in that direction.
It's the same thing when you talk about a Black Pacific. Again, it's a question mark because you're teasing out these ideas. You're not making affirmative judgments. It seems like you're trying to at least, demonstrate that, yes, I mean, at some point in the book, you talk about 50% of some of these whaling ships were occupied by African-American seafarers. And that seems significant enough to ask this question that you're asking. Anyway, that's just my perspective.
Well, also, I think that even non-US Hollies, if I can use that term, they tend to have a suspicion of Black Americans. I think that they see all of us as stalking horses for the United States. And I understand why they think that. I am not a stalking horse. But I think just like I was saying, I might be accused of having certain stereotypes. I think that goes in more than one direction. In haste with Aloha, Letters and Diaries of Queen Emma. Now, Queen Emma, of course, the Hollies were very nervous about her because she was perceived as being pro-London, if I'm not mistaken. They followed the trade winds, African Americans in Hawaii. That has the story about Anthony Allen, the guy I was making reference to. Aloha Betrayed. Now, this is one of the leading books. Actually, this is a Duke University Press book. Duke University Press has been putting out quite a number of books on Hawaii for whatever reason. Native Hawaiian resistance to American colonialism. And of course, you had Hawaiian newspapers from the 19th century up until 1948. So it's a huge database. This scholar, Gunshaw, the German who I referenced to, he draws upon those quite a bit, as does she.
As do you in this book.
Well, she does it more than I do.
Okay.
Hawaii Story by Hawaiian Queen Liliʻuokalani, who, of course, was overthrown in the coup, but lived to tell the tale, to coin a phrase. Her first person narrative.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, as I contrast the indigenous of the mainland with the archipelago, the archipelago, they produced a ton of literature. I mean, now, of course, you might be familiar with Arnold Kupat, K-U-P-A-T, who is a former colleague of mine at Sarah Lawrence. He's been recuperating a lot of Native American literature, written literature, in recent years. And there has been more than we suspected. I mean, for example, in my Texas book, I quote Cherokee newspapers for it.
Right.
But I don't think quantitatively as much has been produced in the archipelago. And as a literature person, you may be familiar with, you may be interested in this: White Lens on Brown Skin, the Sexualization of the Polynesian in American film.
Oh yeah, that's super interesting, definitely.
Yeah. And as I said, Indonesia is going to be part of this U.S. imperialism book. I mean, this 1893 coup book. So this is Dutch American Voices, Letters from the United States. I'm hoping to find in this text how Dutch Americans were in touch with what is now Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, and may have had even interest. And actually, this is useful because it shows you how scholarship works. I mean, you come up with ideas, and maybe I'll come up with something, maybe I won't.
Right, right.
But it's worth a look. And the life and times of Kamehameha.
Oh yeah. Okay. There was Kamehameha the first, second, third, right?
And it went up to the fifth too. I hope
Wow.
my Hawaiian comrades don't get upset with me with my butchered pronunciations.
Yeah. Likewise, I'm sorry about my butchered pronunciations as well.
Reclaiming Kalakaua, 19th century perspectives on a Hawaiian sovereign. There he is. You can see him. During his reign as Hawaiian sovereign from 1874 to 1891. The literary genealogy of misrepresentation.
That sounds really compelling.
Right.
Yeah.
And finally, this is interesting. Pacific Confluence, Fighting Over the Nation in 19th Century Hawaii, written by a Japanese Hawaiian who's at the University of California, San Diego, Christian Sasaki. It's interesting. She does good work, very thoughtful, very modest. I took a lot of notes on this book. So there you have it, my haul from Honolulu.
Well, thanks for sharing all those wonderful resources. We always really love hearing about your new work. So maybe, and you already talked a little bit about it, can you just tell us maybe when we can expect this 1893 book?
Maybe 2 years.
Okay, we have some time then.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, everyone listening and watching, get caught up on Gerald Horne's work on the Pacific, White Pacific, Fighting in Paradise. You have 2 books on Tokyo, if I'm not mistaken. Rising Sun. And do your homework so you'll be prepared in 2 years for this upcoming title. Dr. Horne, thank you once again.
Thank you for inviting me. I was about to say thank you for joining me.
Either way.
Okay.
Okay.
All right,
See
good
you
luck.
soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Now, with regard to Mr. Tyson, like many, perhaps I'm being overly solicitous. Perhaps it's none of my business. But I am concerned about this 58-year-old man getting into the ring nowadays. As our late friend Bell Hooks used to say, the white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, capitalist project needs a shot of adrenaline. And perhaps it is the task of Jake Paul to take on this mission impossible.